because I don't think it's going to get us to a useful outcome. And the reasons for that are twofold. One is that if we're focused on repayment metrics, I don't think colleges have a whole lot of control over that. You know, obviously they have some impact on the quality of education they provide and on some of the labor market outcomes, but given some salary someone's making after they leave college, the college doesn't necessarily control whether they actually decide to write their check that month to their loan servicer. And more importantly, if the goal is to kind of create better incentives for colleges to better serve students, I don't think risk sharing, as it's traditionally talked about, does that, because it's just too far removed from the decisions institutions are making today. So if you want institutions to take action that improves, say, the three-year repayment rates or three-year cohort default rates of their students, yeah, they can do something today about the people they admit and how they serve them, and then those people maybe will graduate in 2, 3, 4, 6, 8 years, and then they'll enter repayment, and they'll have 3 years to get their repayment rate measured, and then we'll reward them or punish them a decade from now for what they did today. But we're actually going to punish them or reward them now for what happened a decade ago. So I mean, I guess it's incentives for universities to invent time machines. But so I think there's a lot of things around risk that's a useful discussion to have about, can we reduce the amount of risk in the system? Can we shift risk in certain ways around certain things? But I think I just wanted to get on the table that kind of the way I think about this is the traditional version of risk-sharing policy proposals. I don't think is like I said, it's a great stump speech. It's a great high-level idea, but the way it's been talked about, I don't think is likely to lead to the outcomes that the people who are promoting it want to see.
Just to jump on one of those points also, and I think even in the video, in our minds we might be thinking that risks are associated to either the student or the institution. And you brought up the loan servicers. I don't know what kind of risk-sharing model the federal government is discussing with respect to servicers and the kind of risks that the servicers introduce into the system too. So I don't think we need to limit our discussion to student risks and institutional risks, but heck, there's servicers that are involved in this process. There's even a risk when the government puts out data, if it's not input-adjusted data, if it's not high-quality data, there's a risk of providing misinformation and holding accountability standards that are just unfair to institutions. And so I think there's a lot of different ways that we got to think about the different stakeholders and the ways that they introduce risks into this whole repayment cycle. And Matt, the time machine point is great. And I always think about two ways to think about this. Like, we can prevent students from falling downriver in the first place in the future versus the students who are already sort of floating down the river and trying to get them out of the river. In the proposals I've seen, the way I understand and think about risk sharing, we oftentimes aren't talking about the students who are already in the river and struggling with their debts, already in default or repayment sort of struggles. And I don't see any risk-sharing policies trying to make those students whole. Rather, they're trying to prevent colleges from putting more students into the river. So I think we also need to think about the students who are living right now with with the struggles of debt, and how with this risk-sharing, any risk-sharing policy can help them, and not just while they're in the stream, not just falling into it in the first place.
Yeah. Well, in fact, even in the most traditional proposals that are out there that you might call risk sharing, the check goes back to the government, not to the student. So it's not actually helping pull them out of the water at all. It's not like borrower defense or something that would.
We're thinking about where's that check kind of coming from?
Yeah.
Right. If we were doing this to, say, for-profit corporations, and there was some profit that was being returned to shareholders, we could say, well, let's take some of that. We're going to sort of punish them. Shareholders are going to take a haircut for these bad outcomes they produce for society and for students. But in this case, if we're risk sharing on a community college, I guess they can write you the check and it's going to affect their bottom line, and maybe in some sense it creates these incentives. But it's sort of a little bit weird to think about, it's a struggling, underfunded institution. Is that really the way to make them better? So one thing I'm hoping that Nick gets a chance to talk about today is the performance funding stuff, because you've done a lot of work on that, something I don't know a whole lot about, but it does seem to kind of connect to this in some way. Right? This was an idea that we're going to create incentives for colleges. We're going to pay them based on outcomes. It sounds great, but I'm not sure how well it's worked in practice.
And Tiffany, too, she's got some good stuff out there on that, too.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. So you've talked about a lot of the risk being to students, but what about the risk to taxpayers? The huge amount of money that the federal government is paying in Pell Grants and other things for a lot of these programs. That's often not even talked about in kind of the risk-sharing proposal. Should it be?
I would say it's helpful to have a conversation around the purpose of higher education and the public good that it does serve. and that matters in terms of how we design a risk-sharing policy because, for example, if you have a specific threshold for institutions closing, what does that mean for the students who would attend there, but also for the greater society, especially in places, I know Nick's done some work around like education deserts, for example. So there's some places where certain colleges and universities kind of serve as an economic hub for a community. So there's social implications, but there's also economic ones when you design a policy that might result in a number of schools closing. And so what's the point of this system? Is it about helping institutions that should improve by aligning incentives and resources to help them to do so? So I think we have to have a kind of a conversation around like what's the end game and then kind of work our way backwards in terms of design. And so in some cases being very careful about the benchmarks that we set in terms of setting the floor and saying if you're below this particular standard, this institution no longer has access to financial aid, for example. And in a lot of cases for low resource campuses, that means they would close. And again, that would have implications for the folks at that institution, but also for the broader society. And so I think it's helpful in the risk sharing conversation to talk about kind of what's the appropriate benchmarks for those floors, but then also what about all those institutions we want to improve that might be just above that cutoff? What kind of incentives and resources could we create to help support them in terms of their ability to improve? Because it's our intention that these institutions would have their doors open to students as well. And then what about those institutions that have the ability to become more selective, right? And so that's what we see in a lot of the literature on the impact of performance-based funding at the state level is the easiest response is to become more selective, especially if there are not additional resources to help you make changes in the way that you provide an education to students. And that's not what we want, right, is to start excluding students in order to win according to these new incentive structures.
This isn't going to answer your question about taxpayers, unfortunately, but it is going to build on Tiffany's point about the sort of purpose of all of this. One upside, and I think you find a lot of agreement on this, one upside would be that we would potentially have new data to help both students navigate the sort of marketplace for higher education, if you want to sort of think about that way, or you can have new data to be an accountability tool for monitoring and enforcing any sort of policy issues. But I think that this is a ripe opportunity to get better data so that we can think more creatively and understand the full sort of fuller scope of the sources of these problems. And this whole idea of tying high stakes financial incentives to institutional performance sounds good on a bumper sticker, but we've got to track it all the way back down, follow that line all the way down to people on campuses, faculty members, staff members. How many of you have worked on a college campus before? My guess is that you didn't work there because you wanted students to fail. My guess is that you worked there because you wanted students to succeed. And so how do we use data to help improve our practice? We don't necessarily not always need high stakes financial accountabilities to help sort of nudge us to do better by students. Sometimes we're reaching our full extent, we're at capacity, and this data might be useful to help us think more creatively and more carefully about the interventions we're doing, regardless of the financial stakes that are involved. So the more we can move away from high stakes financial incentives, I think the better off campuses are going to be in some contexts.
And what, if you were looking at, wanting to have better data on student outcomes, what outcomes would you want to measure?
I'll jump in with a couple. That's a good question. But one is that right now we've got in the college scorecard a student loan repayment rate that people who know the ins and outs of that data better than me chime in. But it does not differentiate, for example, whether a student's in an income-driven repayment plan or if they're in a standard 10-year repayment plan and all the other repayment plans they might be in. And so I think at a minimum you want to be able to calculate repayment according to the plan the students are in. And Matt, you were getting at a point about the amount of debt, not just the number of students who are defaulting or in repayment. I think you were getting at that. Maybe I'm making something up, but I know Doug Weber's been pushing this too. That it's the dollar amount that's involved. Maybe, or you were just saying this to me. Anyways, the dollar amount also matters, not just the number of people, but also the volume of debt that's not being repaid or that's in default.
And I would just add to that, I think program level data becomes really important. And from an equity perspective, that really matters. Not just to assign blame to a particular program so they can be shut down per se, but also because sometimes inequities can be masked when you just look at averages. And so even among institutions that might enroll diverse students, they may not have equal access to programs or having equitable outcomes. And so we're really interested in disaggregated data, especially by race and income, and especially with additional program level data. I think it's really helpful, especially when we're trying to have a conversation around outcomes, especially earnings and repayment. I think it's really important to get a sense of who has access to what.
I think some information on the loan program is going to always be important. I mean, the federal government's operating $1 trillion loan program, making about $100 billion in loans a year. You do want to have some sense of how that portfolio is doing at different places, ideally different programs of study. I think there's been some interesting proposals out there for exactly how to do that. Adam Looney and some of his co-authors have a Hamilton Project proposal. I think the idea is the share the balance pay down. I think it was what Nick, we were talking about. So I think that does have some value, but I think there ought to be more focus on just on the direct economic outcomes of students and less worrying about exactly how things are getting paid down, because that's going to depend on the economic outcomes, but then it's going to also depend on the level of debt, how much, and the decisions people make about, once again, about how to pay it back, whether an income-based repayment, whether they decide to pay it off quickly, which seem to kind of matter less from a policy perspective. So I'm much more interested in, how are people doing economically after they attend a given institution or program of study. And I'm not so interested in their average level of earnings, because I don't think we ought to, privilege institutions that graduates a greater share of engineers relative to teachers necessarily. But I am interested in the people who are clearing some kind of minimum bar, because, obviously higher education is about a lot more than economic outcomes, but I don't think anyone goes into college expecting to end up in poverty after they leave college, right? So I think there's some outcomes that we can agree are so poor that if we see them so consistently for an institution or a program of study, we should think about not sharing that risk, but eliminating that risk both for students and for taxpayers from the system by not having it be eligible for aid. And I agree with all the considerations Tiffany raised about doing that in a way that doesn't have unintended consequences, but I think it's something we probably need to be a lot more aggressive about.
So we've referenced unintended consequences several times, and one reaction to having some sort of risk-sharing policy might be to stop taking risky students in whatever way you might, as an administrator or an institution, define that. What are some ways that we can mitigate against that, with the understanding that that's probably not what we're trying to have people do?
I think step one is to be clear about what we're trying to adjust for. And I think framing matters quite a bit. And so sometimes I've seen framing used that, some students are harder to educate. They take more resources to educate. And so if institutions are taking on the responsibility of educating these hard to educate students, whether they're low income, first gen, students of color, et cetera, then we should not punish them via the system. And so the sentiment is nice, but I think we need to be more honest about the stratification in higher education. And by stratification in higher education, we're talking about these institutions who serve the disproportionate numbers of low-income students and students of color have the least resources. So we're already investing less in these students, and that's P through 20, right? It doesn't just start happening in higher ed. And so we're adjusting for that. We're not adjusting because these students have deficits in their ability to be successful, or they require all of these specialized things. In some cases, in many cases, it's about creating an opportunity to provide them with what we know works. We know class size matters. We know access to mentors that believe in you matters. We know what you teach and how you teach it matters. And so in a lot of cases, again, to Nick's point earlier about people having good intentions at all these campuses wanting to see their students succeed, making sure that we're making equitable investments in these institutions is important. And so that matters for the framing, and so we start talking about, okay, how do you adjust for risk? This is why we have to have a conversation as we're talking about benchmarks. It has to be simultaneous with a question about investment in places like historically Black colleges and universities, community colleges, other open access institutions. And not just necessarily saying, well, if you have a certain number of these students, we want to make a financial adjustment for you because these students they're the ones that are risky. Actually, they've been educated in a very risky system all the way through. And so we're trying to correct for that within this system. And so I think framing matters quite a bit around what's wrong and who's responsible and then what we need to do about it.
Yeah. Can you jump in on that and maybe touch some of the performance-based funding conversation too, if there are lessons to learn there about how we can mitigate this?
Sure. I think to mitigate risks in student loan repayment, if that's the risk that we're going to talk about, I think we need to know the causal mechanisms that are driving people to not being in repayment or in positive repayment outcomes in the first place. And I'm not convinced that I know with a lot of certainty what all those reasons are that are causing students to not repay their loan. I have a hunch on what several of them are, but I think there's still a lot more to learn. So I think before having all the solutions ready, we might want to step back and do some more analysis, and of course this is a faculty member saying this, on sort of what are the factors driving non-repayment in the first place, and can we get to the root of the problem. Only then will we really be able to start to solve it. We might find that there are a number of ways to mitigate those risks, and what might be right for one institution might be very wrong for another. And that does connect to state performance level, or state-based performance funding policies, where states are appropriating money not necessarily just on fixed costs and not necessarily just on enrollment-based formulas. Some states have enrollment-based formulas, but they're basing money, sometimes it's as little as 1%, sometimes it's all of the money, on student outcomes or outputs, like the number of degrees that are completed. And so the bumper sticker for that crowd is that you want to pay for outcomes, not inputs. And so that sounds nice. But when we start to look in the performance management literature, when this kind of funding model has been applied in a number of situations, outside of higher education contexts, it oftentimes doesn't yield the kind of positive results that the bumper sticker would suggest. And so we've seen this time and again where campuses that are in performance-based funding states oftentimes are not outperforming campuses that are in traditional funding states. And so it really gets at issues about resource allocation, back to Tiffany's question about which institutions are benefited and burdened by these funding models. These funding models are not objective. They're created by people. They're created by politicians. They're created by well-minded folks who are trying to improve our systems. But at the same time, there are always going to be challenges, even with a formulaic approach here.
And I think just to piggyback off Nick's point, so in some of the research, right, on performance-based funding, you do see, well, who gets what under these systems? Because the sentiment to focus on outcomes is important. And you do see institutions with higher concentrations of low-income students and students of color receiving even less funding than they were getting before in comparison to their peers using these types of models. That matters a lot. And so in terms of how do you adjust for risk, I think you have to look at income and race. I think you can't ignore the student debt crisis that's very specific to Black students and the experiences that that particular group of students is having in terms of Black college graduates struggling more to repay their loans than white students who don't complete. That matters quite a bit. So you say, well, who would be targeted as a risky student and who might be excluded? I think that matters. So if you're going to adjust for risk, you also have to think about how to incorporate race into the conversation at the state level. A lot of times states will use proxies for race. They'll focus on income, they'll focus on first gen, and there's all sorts of reasons why that is, political reasons and practical reasons, but they're not going to yield the results. They'll continue to implement a system that will stratify higher education more than it already is.
And Stella Flores and Toby Park are two faculty members and colleagues who have looked at just this issue, and they say once you condition on these pre-college characteristics of injustice and inequalities, students who are attending what would be poor performing institutions by most metrics, or by several of these metrics we're throwing around, actually look quite well, and they're actually outperforming others. So getting the metrics right is extremely, extremely difficult, especially if you're not accounting for what Tiffany just outlined.
Yes, and just one more, just to piggyback on that. So EdTrust included in an analysis, we released a report on Black student success last year and did just that, tried to use peer groups, which is really important, and part of the risk adjustment is comparing institutions, like institutions, to their peers. And HBCUs, for example, once compared to predominantly white institutions that serve similar numbers of or percentages of low-income students, had slightly better outcomes for the Black students as in comparison to those institutions. So just another example of why it's important to talk about peer groups as you're trying to figure out how to do a risk-adjusted system.
Did you say that black college graduates default more likely than white non-graduates? Is that what you said?
That's some of the new research that's been coming out,
That's
that
horrifying.
points to that. I think Robert Kelchen recently did a helpful analysis, and there's been a number of pieces that have come out over the last maybe 6 months. CAP did a nice analysis that looked very specifically at the experiences that Black students are having, and I think you can't talk about that without talking about, the racial wealth gap and history of this country and persistent issues with, racial inequality in both the educational and the economic systems. To Matt's point earlier about these other factors, about why and how students are able to repay their loans that sometimes go beyond, because completion matters a lot, right? But in some cases, the impact of racism is more persistent than that.
So there's a lot of talk and policy in the K-12 space around kind of subgroup accountability, and thinking about gaps between performance in a certain school, or thinking about measuring the performance of, say, students of color or low-income students, and then having accountability based on that. Is that something that should be part of the risk-sharing discussion, since we know that there are huge equity gaps in higher education too, or does that get us, back worse towards the I'm not going to take any risky students?
I would say that it has to be a part of a holistic accountability system. I think we can have a discussion about what pieces of that system do what, but I think defining success as not just having high outcomes, but also enrolling and graduating low-income students and students of color, and looking at how well those students are doing is important. And I think for institutions that have high outcomes but these large gaps, they shouldn't get the gold star for success, right? We should also be thinking about incentives to encourage them to close those gaps as well. I think the Aspire Act is one example where they've tried to define success, again, not just as high completion rates, but also as success for low-income students in that particular context. And then if you penalize wealthy institutions that aren't serving low-income students well, you can use those resources to reinvest into those campuses where those students are enrolled, so that they can use those resources to make improvements.
So,
I was going to jump in, but I wasn't sure, Matt, if you were going to weigh in. If I'm going to sort of, if we're forced to design some sort of risk-sharing policy, I would say two things that
you're writing HEA right now.
Right, that's right.
Write it down.
But there would be two ways to tailor, and I think that these get at that earlier point about the different dimensions of risk in the first place, and how to think about just the exposure, the probability of being exposed to the risk, and then the severity of it. I think there are a couple ways to kind of get at that I don't think I've seen a lot of discussion around, and one of them would be to, first of all, just incorporate a measure of just what percentage of students are borrowing in the first place, and making sure that's a component of this risk-sharing formula, whatever that might end up looking like. But I also think that there's something to it. I can't quite put my finger on it, but if a college it disperses a loan to a student and retains 100% of that loan that they disperse to the student as tuition revenue, that presents a whole different dynamic to risk than a college that is simply a pass-through. They are not dispersing, they're not keeping that loan as revenue to the institution. They're simply passing it through to a student who is then using that loan for non-tuition expenses. So in the first scenario, a college has every incentive to keep all that loan volume as revenue. And sometimes I hear people say that all loans are revenue to colleges, and that's not the case. The second college is one that disperses that debt back out to the student so they can pay their living expenses, for example. Just takes on a very different risk profile, and I can't quite put my finger on it, but I think there's something to it that matters in terms of how much of that loan volume is revenue to the college versus pass through.
Well, and the colleges would also say that they're not allowed to tell the students not to take out those loans, so it might be unfair to hold them accountable for it.
And you have community colleges that I'm going to guess are using the loan to disperse to the student, and then the student is not using that for tuition revenue, or the student's not using that to pay tuition but non-tuition expenses, and then you might create an incentive for colleges to opt out of the loan programs altogether,
Interesting.
which would bring its own set of implications Tiffany was getting at.
And many community colleges already do.
So, Matt, you've kind of raise questions about whether risk sharing, as we've talked about it, is a good idea in the first place, but you also have what I think is a very thoughtful proposal that you've put out there. So can you talk a little bit about if you were, under the gun and forced to write one right now, what do you think the best way of doing it would be? What would you propose?
Sure. So in the fall or early winter, my Urban Institute colleague Kristen Blagg and I put out a paper where we sort of talked about some of these issues. I think our task was to design a risk-sharing plan, and we sort of thought about it for a while and realized this is actually kind of a bad idea. But it wouldn't have been very polite to send in a paper that just said, this is a bad idea. So we wrote half a paper about why it's a bad idea, and I encourage you to read that half. And then we said, well, what would be a more helpful way to take some of these, really legitimate concerns that I think people have around risk and outcomes in higher ed. And so we kind of started with, well, what are people trying to do here with risk sharing? And I think what folks are trying to do is create better incentives for colleges to support student success. But as I talked about earlier, the problem is these incentives are not going to work in a risk sharing system where the rewards and consequences are many years removed from the actions that are being taken. So I think that the basic idea that I'd want folks to take away from the paper is less the specific proposal as we fleshed it out, and more this idea, well, can we think of ways that through the policy levers that we have, and if we're here in Washington, through HEA, that we can use those policy levers to create much more short-term incentives for colleges to do things that we think are going to be good for students. So the example that we talk about in the report is completion, but at the semester level. Because once again, we try and tie funding to 6-year graduation rates. That's going to be so far removed. Like, if colleges want to increase their graduation rate 6 years from now, what are they going to do? Well, probably first call the admissions office. But in terms of a student completing this semester, well, maybe that's more of a kind of a tractable problem. Maybe they can, take attendance more often, call up students who aren't showing up. Maybe there are things they can do, and if you get them to complete the semester, you can imagine, well, maybe they'll show up for the next semester, and maybe sort of success will beget success, and it actually will have some of the long-term effects we want to see on completion of degrees, loan repayment, economic outcomes, and the like. So we talk about it in the paper in the context of a change to the return to Title IV rules, which I tie myself in knots every time I try to explain it. So I think I'll just refer folks to the paper. But it basically requires institutions to bear some of the cost or more of the cost than they do now when a student drops out partway through the semester. And we tie it to a sort of an aid like a paycheck type proposal. The idea being that students will get their aid, whether it's Pell or loans, dispersed like a paycheck over the course of the semester. So if they stop showing up halfway through, they won't be on the hook for the loans for the half of the semester that they were never there for. So it'll sort of reduce risk by not dispersing loans that really should have never been dispersed in the first place. So those are kind of the two pieces, but then we kind of talk about it along with a couple of other proposals. One is setting sort of a lower high water mark, whatever you want to call it, for basic economic outcomes like the share getting over a certain poverty threshold, because I think there really is a federal interest through these grant loan programs of having some protection for consumers and for taxpayers. And if we see that there are places where things just aren't working, the outcomes are just really bad, I don't think we want to slap someone on the wrist or have them write a check 7 years from now. I think we want to have people not go there anymore. We want that to happen as soon as possible. We talk about the need to tell institutions, if you're going to take Pell Grants, you also got to take loans. We can't have institutions opting out of the loan program because there's just no good reason to allow institutions to take the grants but not let their students take loans. So that's kind of the package ideas that we talk about, but I think the one that I would just say again and emphasize, the real point here is thinking about if we want to kind of reduce risk in the system and shift risk around and create incentives for institutions, how can we do that in a really targeted way so that you pass the law and then colleges have something that's pretty concrete that they can focus on and not something so far removed.
So you brought up kind of the federal role in all of this, which obviously is relevant given where we're sitting right now. And we've talked a little bit both about institutions that are just really performing very, very badly, and also institutions that are doing not great, but that we want to see improve, and that the best course of action probably isn't just shutting all of those down. Is there a federal role to be had in both of those scenarios? And And if so, kind of how should we think about balancing those in the next kind of policy discussion?
I mean, the technocratic sort of buzzkill would be
neither. If you say neither, I'm kicking you off the panel.
Sorry. Well, I think when you have external pressure, and this is what we learn from the performance management literature outside of higher education in a lot of different domains. When you have these external pressures, you have this sort of belief in the performance doctrine that incentives will create all these positive responses, and if we just can get better accountability, we'll get better outcomes. Like, I want to believe that. But I think that buying fully into that accountability doctrine also requires us to see the accountability paradox, that you have external regimes that are like pushing on change, not necessarily knowing the source of the problem, but because it fits on a bumper sticker. And so you have that, and sort of balanced on the other end is this organizational learning, this sort of internal organizational learning. So the people who raised their hands earlier about people on campuses who are actually doing this work and using this data, how would this information be helpful for your practice? What kind of routines of learning might the federal government be able to help support and invest for campuses to really understand and diagnose their unique problems related to risks? That's a very different future from the sort of external regime of saying you've got to meet these performance standards, and doing so you will improve or get kicked out. That's a very different thing, and that's the performance paradox that we run into.
When I think about the federal role, especially from kind of a consumer protection perspective, the federal government has played an important role historically in terms of kind of as an advocate role almost for folks who are disenfranchised. And so if I think about predatory colleges and universities taking advantage of students, in many cases, a lot of these institutions have been found to be for-profit colleges and universities. They're not the only set of institutions that need to improve outcomes. However, if institutions are acting in ways that are harmful to students, I definitely believe it's the role of the federal government to no longer allow tax dollars to be used in those ways, right? So I think that that's an important role. I think where we have to, when we talk about risk sharing, it's not about undoing some of the protections that we already have. It's about maintaining those and strengthening those, whether it be through gainful employment regulation, whether it be through borrow defense, or some of these mechanisms that are in place to try and protect students from predatory institutions, I think is really important. Now to the institutions, right, we want everyone to be improving, especially in terms of their service of low-income students and students of color. I think that there is an opportunity, especially as the federal government uses its resources to be thinking strategically about how to invest, again, not just in those places, but then also you talk about what strategies do campuses need to implement to actually improve completion, and making sure that that part, whether it's, maybe it is innovative practices, and on the other hand, sometimes it's accounting for. So I think we also have to think about the fact that the federal government doesn't only invest in colleges and universities through the federal financial aid system, that they get funneled quite a lot of dollars via a lot of the other departments for research grants and the like. And so again, if you look at who gets what resources in totality from the federal government, it again is concentrated at these wealthy institutions. And so I think the federal government does have an opportunity. So in a lot of, again, I mentioned Aspire earlier, you even see in Shaheen Hatch, the approach they use for risk sharing, these kind of creating pooled funds from the penalties that can then be reinvested into institutions so that they can strategize. I don't know that the federal government needs to, prescribe what institutions should do, but providing the incentives and then also the resources could be helpful, especially for those institutions that have been under-resourced over time.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I think the federal government has a responsibility to be a good steward of taxpayer dollars and be more aggressive at, at getting out the really bad actors. I mean, I don't have to close them, but just, cut off their access to aid. For these institutions kind of in the middle who we want to create incentives for them to improve, I guess I'm just pretty skeptical that there is some technocratic formula that we can design here in Washington that is going to, do more good than harm at, a very diverse set of institutions in terms of private nonprofits, for-profit colleges, public institutions, which are really the, province of state and local governments. So in my mind, a very natural federal role for the federal government to do a lot more is on data and transparency. Right? I think there's an obvious federal role for creation of a better student information system that could provide better data both on outcomes, but you could also think about how a system like that could perhaps track things that happen within institutions. A student, if that system had information on student enrollment by semester or transcript data or something like that. Thinking about more narrow questions about how students progress through college towards their degrees. Is that going to fix all the problems? I mean, I don't think it will, for a lot of reasons that I'm sure all of us have talked and written about. But to me, that is the most natural federal role.
And we've talked about kind of the stratification within higher ed, and also that there's lots of different kinds of institutions, and so risk sharing in the singular way would play out very differently at lots of different kinds of institutions. Talk a little bit about how we should think about peer institutions and how some of these accountability policies might impact those different groups.
One of the struggles I've seen with state performance-based funding is that there is this pressure to compare the performance of an institution to the performance of their peers. And an institution that's performing just kind of average and all their peers are tanking, they would look like they're doing great. Not because of anything that they did, but because their peers are tanking. And so I'm not talking about you personally, but I'd look like an angel if I was sitting by the devil.
Yeah.
So it matters on who you're comparing yourself to. And so I think that's one of the challenges. If we start to get into peer group comparisons, we're going to run into that. And there's going to be decisions along the way that make one peer group seem unfair to another.
I think what's most important is to consider the context. And so that may result in some sort of comparison of peers and maybe not. But I think the factors that need to be taken into account to consider the context of an institution, of course, we've talked at length about who they enroll mattering. But I also think that resources matter. I think we've had conversations around, well, what is this? Different types of institutions have different types of incentive structures and governance structures. I think for-profit colleges and universities are different and distinct. And so although we'd like to see better student outcomes in that space, I wouldn't necessarily say we should take all of the funds from any sort of penalty and create a fund that we reinvest into for-profit colleges to be able to do better. I would probably think about that in the context of nonprofit colleges and universities that are low resource, that have shown over time some sort of commitment to providing access to higher education from students who would otherwise struggle to have that access. So I think because of those things, we have to be very thoughtful, more so not necessarily to set up a comparison, but to say, one, we know what colleges do matters, because you do see in a lot of cases campuses that serve similar students and have somewhat similar resources maybe have different outcomes. And so if we know what they do matters to student outcomes, it's not just, we serve a particular demographic, this is the best we can do. I think we should also be thinking about taking that context into account when we decide how to treat them in any sort of risk-sharing system.
You want to add anything there? No. Great. Great, so let's get all of you into the conversation. Molly is going to walk around with a microphone, so just go ahead and raise your hand.
Hi. So, Dr. Jones, you mentioned a Shaheen bill, is that correct, on risk sharing? Do you mind going over some of that, what the basic proposal would be?
Sure. I think a couple of highlights of that particular proposal. One, so we've talked at length around, there's other things that impact a student's ability to repay their loans. It's not just did they complete college, it's what's happening in the economy. So one thing that bill does is it takes into account making institutions responsible, of course, for paying a portion of the loan balance. It's about 5% of those students who are not able to pay down at least $1. They will take that loan balance, and the institution would be responsible, and this is a rough summary, so don't take super precise notes, but they would be responsible for paying back a portion of that. But what they do try to do in the Shaheen bill is try to correct for the fact that, look, if we're going through a recession, I mean, that impacts folks' ability to get jobs and repay loans. And so they take the unemployment rate, and I believe that you multiply that balance by the unemployment rate, and then you subtract that from the entire balance that the institution would be, the portion that they'd be responsible for. So that's just an example of type of factors I think that are important in terms of like kind of what makes that proposal a little bit distinct is that they try to take that into account. There's still some concerns around equity because, again, I've mentioned, race is important and black students facing a crisis and their ability to repay their loans. We know typically the black unemployment rate is almost twice that of their white counterparts. So if you're just doing the average unemployment rate, you still are not correcting for those types of differences. So I think that it's helpful thinking and framing that they're doing around like, well, the economy matters and so does what colleges do, but probably still need a little bit more thought around how do you make those distinctions based on who an institution serves. So those institutions serving a large proportion of, let's say, black students might not get the same kind of benefit, right, a white institution would have from that sort of model. But at a high level, at some of what that bill tries to do, a couple of other things in there is that I believe at 15%, they're setting the floor. And so institutions whose cohort default rates are higher than 15% and below.
I think it's repayment, right?
Repayment rates,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, yes.
Yeah.
Repayment rates are 15% and below. They would be ineligible for federal financial aid for 3 years. And then that if you have at least a repayment rate of 25%, then you would be able to be eligible for a fund that they would set up from penalties that they would collect. And you could use some of those resources to try to use for strategies to improve. The kind of the issue there is like, what about that 15 to 25%? We would assume those at 16, 17, 18, we want to do better. And so are those the types of campuses we'd want to invest in? Should they also be eligible for some sort of investment to help them improve? I think another question is around the way I understand it, institutions that are not a part of the federal loan program are kind of exempt. And so just thinking about some of the stuff we've been talking about in terms of institutions being incentivized to kind of opt out and what impact that would have on students who rely on the Pell Grant. And I think one other kind of issue there is just kind of thinking about what happens to institutions that close. And so we kind of run some rough analyses and looked at the breakout of like what type of campuses, if this was implemented, would be impacted. It was disproportionately for-profit colleges and universities, but among those nonprofit, and by disproportionate, it was somewhere around like 75, 80%. But of those campuses that were not for-profit colleges and universities, what kind of nonprofits were they? And they were disproportionately community colleges and HBCUs. And so I think all those things are important as we kind of think through. But there were some helpful things they were doing by creating a tiered system, not just you're cut off or not. I think thinking about how do you incorporate aspects of the economy, I think is helpful thinking as well.
But I would just come back to the incentives that a system like that creates for colleges, right? So this bill passes, and you're the president of University of New Hampshire, and you come into office and your numbers come out and they're not so good. You have to write this big check to the government. So you're just, okay, we're gonna make a big effort. We're gonna fix things. You undertake all these initiatives. You do a great job. Retention's up, graduation's up. A year later, things are great, and then your data comes in based on the kids 7 years ago instead of 8 years ago, and you got to write another big penalty check to the government. So I think that's really the the problem with these kinds of proposals, that they just never get around. It doesn't matter what set of parameters you put into them and how you calculate the unemployment rate and what the percentage is of the repayment or default, blah, blah, blah. That's the kind of the fundamental problem. I know I keep coming back to this dead horse, but I think it's really important.
Anything you want to add, Nick? No? Great. Question?
Hi, I've spent the past 5 years teaching fairly competitive colleges, and my experience is that even there, your median student doesn't complete half the readings. So I'm wondering how to make students responsible in this system. Maybe you could have it so that colleges only need to show employment outcomes for people with above a 3.0 GPA or something like that, but I could imagine that creating some perverse incentives too. So how do you balance the responsibilities of the students and the responsibilities of the schools?
I think part of the idea is that students already bear quite a bit of responsibility. I mean, they're borrowing to pay for college, and they're borrowing more than they used to, especially as net prices go up. And if there's options, and I've long been a proponent of limiting the amount of subsidies we run through the loan system to decrease the perverse incentives and kind of the windfall handouts that go go to borrowers to try and ensure that people who can pay do pay. But we do have a system that, we collect on the loans, and if you don't pay them, they eventually garnish your wages. And if you still haven't paid, they eventually garnish your Social Security, and they'll take your earned income tax credit. And I think there's some changes that ought to be made to that system. But I think the idea behind the discussion today is that students do bear quite a bit of responsibility here, and the question is, can we put more pressure on colleges to have an impact on the part of all this that they do have some impact on. And sure, at the end of the day, some people aren't going to do the reading, some people are not going to do the work. But the question is, on the margin, how can these institutions better provide the supports to help more students be successful?
We've been doing a lot of public opinion research about people's attitudes towards higher education and how they define value within higher education and return on investment. And it's fascinating because in comparison to the K-12 system, where people blame everyone but the student when there's failure, in the higher ed system, they blame the student. And 100% of the time, basically, that's where they start, is to say, if a student feels out of college, whose fault is it? That's the student's fault. The only thing that actually moved them off of that at all was showing them just the systemic nature of the problems at some places. So when you show them, for example, places that have a 10 or 15% completion rate, then they would be less likely to say, well, probably 90% of people are just failing out because they drank too much. Like, there's probably something wrong if 9 out of 10 of the students aren't completing at that institution. So if you showed them macro numbers, they could get to a place where they were thinking someone else might have some power to change the system, but they very much start out in a place that just says, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and do your reading. So it's an interesting kind of start. In fact, it was true of the students too. We did a bunch of focus groups very recently with students, and they said that it was their responsibility.
That also taps into, when we talk about students, we all probably have our own assumptions of what image comes to mind when we think about the classroom you just described, or the students that we're talking about. And my bet is that if we were to pick one student from the country at random, it's not going to look like who you think. It's going to be an older student, probably working full-time, probably caring for dependents, has a number of other responsibilities in their lives, and there might be good reason why they're not doing their readings, and it might also be this whole loan non-repayment thing might actually be a symptom of way bigger problems than the institution's performance. It's super complex, and if we don't sort of see that humanity of it, I think we're just going to be missing the picture the whole way through.
And I would just only add that this shift to help campuses start to take some responsibility is really, really important, because higher education, I used to work in admissions, you make certain guarantees and promises to students and families and adult students and their families about what they're getting. And so I think it's really, really important that they take that responsibility. So if a student comes to a college or university who says, our students should graduate in 4 years or 6 years, then you would assume that the academic programs are structured in a way that if you take the courses that you're supposed to take when you're supposed to take them, that you will be done in that time. What we know with what's gone on in terms of restructuring over the last 5 to 10 years, that wasn't always the case. Sometimes the requirements far exceeded what you could actually complete in 4 years. It's just one example of why it's important to have a conversation not just about what students are doing, but what institutions are doing. Have you even created the conditions by which all of your students can be successful or should expect to be successful if they proceed accordingly? And we're not there yet in higher ed. A lot of good work has been done, but we have a long way to go. And like we said, students already bear most of the responsibility anyway.
Yeah. We had a question up here.
Hi, I'm Frank Ballman at the National Association of State Student Grant and Aid Programs. And as you know, a lot of the states have performance funding metrics. So I'm curious for the panel's thoughts on a couple of things. First, if you're only going to reauthorize HEA every 10 years, there's risk that your metrics become obsolete pretty quickly, because when states started doing performance funding several years ago, it was about graduation rates, and they realized, okay, community colleges don't necessarily graduate, they transfer. Now, oddly, the new breaking news is people are stopping out because they're non-traditional students and they have a much better job and they no longer need So stop out is in some ways now a good thing, but that's not going to always be the case. So I'm curious what you envision as a sort of creating a framework for fluidity of metrics. And Tiffany made some very good points about race, things like that. NASGAP's position for a while has been that any metric should reflect, like say, what are the metrics for Pell recipients as a proxy for at-risk students, but that's not perfect. But the challenge is, say, if we had a metric for Pell recipients who are African-American students, a admissions office might think twice about admitting someone, so you don't want to create the access issue. And finally, say on cohort default rate, I think we can all agree is a horrible metric, is the worst actors gamed it by giving people 3 years of forbearances. Loan repayment rate is better, but to the extent that a lot of people have unsub loans, so by definition they're going to graduate with a higher balance than they started with. And I've heard different things about how you'd measure loan repayment. Maybe making payments as agreed is a better metric. So if someone's in IBR and they're making their $25 or $50 payments, maybe that's a better metric. But what's maybe a framework for a long-term solution to this?
Boy, I don't have an answer. And let me say just a couple of things though before the point I'm trying to make. Is that the work that NASGAP is doing, and Matt, I think a few years ago you did the report on like all the different aid programs within states. I mean, even within state aid programs, you've got 250, 400, I forget the number of different aid programs around the country, but like even within those, you're saying there are just a number of different measures of what, or accountability measures sort of embedded in all of those. And I would say the overlap from state performance-based funding models overlapping with the conversations I hear in DC on federal policymaking, there's a big gap between the two. I haven't seen any states put in their funding models anything related to student loan debt or student loan repayment. Maybe I'm missing something, but I think to your point, what I've seen, at least at the state level, whether it's the aid programs or the funding models themselves, have a huge gap with using the same metrics, if that's what you're getting at. There's not a nice sort of pipeline of metrics that I've seen.
I'll just add to that. I've seen some states do more stuff related to like job placement and sometimes earnings, but that gets really murky because students often will leave a state after they graduate and work somewhere else, and so sometimes institutions would be penalized if they have a lot of students who would leave. So it's not perfect by any means. I think flexibility is important to a certain extent, and I think you also have to think about for that piece around places becoming more selective, where you align your rewards and making sure you're looking at input metrics, so who they're serving, whether it be Pell or by race, and making sure you're rewarding institutions accordingly for doing that. That's not happening right now. So when people say in performance funding, we need to stop focusing on inputs and focus on outcomes, they're just talking about numbers of students, period. There's not a higher ed weighted formula like you have seen, for example, in California, local control funding, where they provide more resources for places that have larger numbers of underserved students. So when we're saying we should consider inputs, we're saying specifically that we're trying to align the rewards and incentives for those particular populations. So for a framework, I think you have to do that. And maybe there's some flexibility around exactly how you do it. I think you need some of those progress metrics, like Matt was talking about, some of those immediate things that campuses can do and see some sort of reward for the work that they've put in. So you have to look at retention and persistence, maybe semester by semester or year to year. And then, of course, you have to look at those outcome metrics and some sort of kind of formula of that, and completion has to be a part of that, along with maybe there's some of the economic pieces that are valuable as well. And I would just kind of also throw in there, I think cohort default rate tells us something, it just doesn't tell us enough. And so you don't want to build a whole accountability system with that being your sole metric, but I would suggest using anything like repayment rates on top of cohort default rates. But I think framing-wise, the best systems do that. Where you run into problems where it severely increases stratification is when the emphasis is too much on the outcomes piece and not considering the inputs, or maybe missing the progress metrics altogether and not getting those right, I think are critical.
I think the question you raised about flexibility over a long span of HEA reauthorization is a really interesting one. It kind of raises a question in my mind: is it better in the next HEA for Congress to say, here's exactly what the new set of metrics should be, and here's how they shall work until we come back to this in however many years? or should some flexibility be provided to, say, the Department of Education within some kind of framework to move the parameters around to deal with, unexpected changes in the economy or, the unintended consequences that were by definition unintended. Now, of course, the risk there is that when you provide that flexibility, do you then have to worry about the political pressure from the institutions that are going to lose something, right? And sometimes that can be the for-profits, but sometimes it can be, public institutions who maybe ought to, not come out so well in these things, but have, depending on the political winds, have some say in Washington. So I think that's kind of the downside of that. So it's a question about how to balance those things.
And I think, I don't know if meta is still a cool word, but like to be meta for a second, I think that what I'm reflecting on with this conversation is that this is why it's so important to get this right, or at least to have a thorough conversation about what a risk-sharing model might potentially look like, because once it's in, and it's going to be hard. How many of these aid programs exist, right? It's hard, once something's on the books, hard to get it removed. And so that policy maintenance is going to be a big issue. So getting it right on the front end is going to be important.
Yeah. Questions? Oh, you want to go right here, and then we'll go in the back.
Hi. I don't have much of a background in education other than formerly have been a student, but in the video, it talked about how risk sharing was, excuse me, let me look at my notes really quick. If universities were unable to provide students with the skills necessary to perform in the job market, and the conversation has mostly been about getting jobs in the job market. So what exactly are students entitled to?
Great question.
I mean, this comes back to the conversation we were having earlier about the role of the student, the role of the institution. I think ideally, if I could be omnipotent for a moment, what I would want to kind of know is when a student goes to an institution and enrolls in some kind of program of study, especially one where the goal is relatively well defined. When someone goes, say, into a nursing program to get a nursing degree, I would like to know sort of what are the expectations of the student? Like, what do they have to do to sort of hold up their end of the bargain? And then what does the college have to do to hold up their end of the bargain? And then I'd want to come back a few years later and see, some sense of who held up their end of the bargain, right? And if the student held up their end of the bargain to the best of their ability, and the college didn't, more often than not, well, then I would be concerned about that. Whereas if the college sort of always held up their end of the bargain, but there were just things beyond their control and it didn't always work out for students, then I would be less concerned, at least from the perspective of the college. So I think that's kind of the conceptual frame that I put on it. Of course, we don't measure that. So it's a question of what sort of approximation can we get to based on that, which is where I kind of come back to, are people, not economically miserable after, like there's some bar where we just know that this isn't an issue of who's going or risk adjustment. This is just that, this is not an outcome that would be acceptable under any sort of circumstances.
Yeah, I'm sorry, please
No,
go.
go ahead.
No, I was in that video, and I thought it was an effective video, and it got me thinking when I saw that car drive across the screen. I was like, the awkward economics says we shouldn't be comparing this investment in education, investment in human capital, to investment in a car, for example. If I don't make a payment on my car loan, it's going to get taken away. If I don't make a payment on my student loan, that knowledge that I've gained, that human capital I've developed, is still here with me. And so just the awkward economics of me being part of my educational process is really important to all of this. So your question, I think, speaks at a huge issue about purposes of education, of course, but I think it also requires us to not correlate investment in education with investment in other capital, items, I guess.
And I think you're tapping into one of the most difficult things about this whole higher ed accountability conversation, which is we don't measure learning. We don't, right? And so we don't measure it in a way that folks broadly agree on. And so kind of a part of, that's why I said risk sharing has to be talked about in the context of like higher ed accountability more broadly. And one of those other pillars of that is around something like accreditation that does these deeper dives into what's happening on a campus, what are students experiencing, what kind of climate, are they safe on campus, are they having positive interactions with faculty, are faculty teaching them, is it grad students, are those faculty well supported, and how does that impact those students and their ability to receive a high quality education? What's the value add of an institution? So is it that this institution has admitted a bunch of students who had really high test scores and GPAs, and they didn't really offer them a whole lot of value add besides maybe name recognition of a university, or maybe they did get there and get a phenomenal experience and learn a tremendous amount, but because we're not measuring those things, it does complicate. And so to Nick's point earlier, a lot of what we're doing is using the best proxies that we have, but we don't always know exactly how to connect everything that a university is doing to a particular student outcome. We do still need better data and information. So what do we do about that? I think is having a broader conversation around accountability, but also being thoughtful around things like accreditation reform and how to talk more so about what's happening on campuses and how that's tied to outcomes can be helpful as we're thinking about some of the higher level accountability.
I think the relative role of the institution and the student is especially murky on the kind of path from enrollment to completion. It's sort of this black box. We don't know what's going on. I think where there's some more clarity is once people graduate, and once again, particularly in fields where if you actually finish the program in nursing, to go back to my example before, the institution has said that this person did what they're supposed to do. We gave them the degree, but then you failed the nursing exam. Well, then that starts to be, it was in your interest to pass the nursing exam, so that there I'm more inclined to be like, well, what happened? Why did this college say that this person was ready to be a nurse, but they couldn't pass the nursing exam? Or if they didn't have the right skills to get a job, I'd be concerned about that. So when we can observe meaningful outcome measures for the people who do complete, I think that's important to keep in mind, even as we want to be concerned by who's not completing.
And let's go to the back for a couple of questions.
Hi, just to piggyback on that a little bit, my question was similar about talking about accountability in institutions in terms of incentivizing them to look at not just the current economy and helping students prepare for the workforce, but also the future economy, and how do we incentivize institutions to, at various levels, either have apprenticeship programs, work with local employers, have them look at their curriculum and say, is our curriculum working for students in the real world? Is it going to be helping them with the jobs of the future as things are going to continue to change? And I just wondered if you guys had any particular thoughts on that.
I've got two initial thoughts, and I got to qualify this. That question is not totally in the area of my expertise, so this is dangerous. But I would say that.
But you're on Capitol Hill, so you're welcome to it.
Yeah, right. I think there's some emerging research. A colleague of mine in Madison, Matt Hoare, has got a book called Beyond the Skills Gap. There's this belief in the skills gap, that it exists and that it's a thing, but kind of like risk sharing, once you start to scratch the surface, it starts to kind of disappear. And so this notion that a skills gap exists in the first place is one that I'm not entirely sure that there is agreement on. And I think, second of all, we come back to this idea of not just mission differentiation, but resource differentiation with respect to the diversity of institutions. I mean, depending on how you count them, you got 4,000, 5,000 colleges across the U.S. You got that many of number of different purposes of education. And so I don't know that tailoring any sort of accountability regime around job placement or this perceived skills gap is going to be the right solution for a broad federal policy.
I would say that this is one of those things that, in terms of looking at the state level, because outcomes-based funding has been around for a little while now you have about 35 states who have some sort of outcomes-based funding policy where the funding for colleges is dependent on outcomes. It does help to drive these conversations. So that, along with state setting attainment goals and all of these things kind of happening at once, creates a perfect storm where colleges are probably now more than ever talking about how do we connect more with workforce needs and filling these skills gaps. I think there's questions around, again, like maybe that's one purpose but not the sole purpose of higher education, but it matters quite a bit, and we have to have these conversations if students are having trouble repaying their loans. Like, that's what's driving the conversation. So it's not, I think it's important not to limit the focus or purpose of higher education to just be, economic outcomes, but I do think it's a relevant conversation, especially for those students who struggle to pay for college, struggle to repay their loans, to be more thoughtful about how colleges and universities can create the best conditions possible for those students to have that type of success as well. And I've seen institutions start to move in that way, and sometimes it's the result of those conversations happening at the state policy level around outcomes in ways that weren't happening maybe 15 years ago.
Yeah. We have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm Courtney from Senator Kane's office. So you all touched a little bit on community colleges, but just wanted to hear more about what a well-designed system would look like with regards to community colleges and making sure it's equitable as well.
I think the first thing that comes to my mind, and this is what came up in the paper, I kind of felt similarly, Matt, as I was writing my paper on risk sharing. I was not entirely sold on the idea, so maybe read the last half of my paper. First half of Matt's, last half of mine. But in that's one question I had, and I just come back to an earlier point about exposure to debt in the first place, and making sure that you have a community college where maybe 1 in 10 students are borrowing in the first place, but they might have a poor repayment outcome. That's a very different situation than other colleges where 100% of students are exposed to debt and they have a poor outcome. So I think at the minimum, incorporating that exposure or that sort of probability of borrowing in the first place is going to be a core thing that's got to be in any of these sort of proposals. And they're not always there. It's surprising. It's such an easy solution.
Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes, I believe it was in Robert Kelchin's piece that he did in terms of suggesting that you decouple the aid program from the loan program for that reason. So if we're in the case that an institution either opts out of the loan program, that you are still accounting, you don't want to eliminate their ability to provide grant aid to students via the Pell Grants, or you also want to just be careful so that in the case of community colleges, you aren't necessarily incentivizing more of them to opt out of the loan program, because you do have so many students that if they are able to go full-time, they do rely on federal student loans for their living expenses. So I think that's relevant. I think you have to be very careful around things like coupling risk sharing with aid like a paycheck in those contexts, because if they are paying for their housing, and the approach used in Prosper, for example, where, kind of what happens if those students are being required to pay back part of that penalty that is pushed on the institution. So aid like a paycheck in and of itself doesn't have to be as problematic, but I think coupled with risk sharing models that push some of the recouping back onto students rather than institutions taking on more of that responsibility like Matt was proposing, could also be problematic, because in that case, if you're using it for your living expenses, what kind of happens if you face academic difficulty? Are you going to be evicted if you're using it to pay your rent, for example? Or if you're not at a community college, if you're at a residential institution, are they going to evict students? What's going to happen there? So I think it raises all sorts of questions, which basically around kind of the need to be really careful around institutions not being able to pass on more of that penalty onto students. I think is especially important at places like community colleges, and then being considerate around ways to decouple the aid in the loan system, either on the penalty side and on the eligibility side. So if institutions are ineligible for aid, just making sure that you aren't, in the effort to control what's happening with student debt, prohibit students' access to grant aid programs. Others would say, actually, this is why you need to make sure that institutions are not able to opt out, because so many community colleges already do. The community colleges are places where we do want to see improved outcomes, but at the same time, institutions are distinct. So for example, students default at much higher rates at for-profits than they do at community colleges. But if you just look at completion, you would say, well, community colleges need to improve their completion rates as well, which we would advocate. We hope they would improve their completion rates. But just being with an eye, if you're looking at something like default, just kind of points to another need to distinguish between institutional type within the system.
Like 2 quick points on this question. And the first is, I think colleges absolutely ought to, have to offer loans to their students, especially, we now have some pretty good evidence. We always talk about people borrowing too much, want people to borrow less, but there's actually a population of people that borrow too little, and they're less likely to compete because instead of borrowing a couple $1,000s more a year, they're working an extra 20 hours a week. It doesn't serve them, it doesn't serve anybody well. And so we now have some evidence that when colleges package loans for, this study was done from a community college, students complete more credits, they're more likely to be successful because they are borrowing more. So I think there's just a lot of good reasons that we ought to require community colleges to participate in the loan program. If they participate in the grant program, I can't imagine anyone is going to say, well, we're not going to do Pell Grants anymore, because I think they would all be out of it. I don't think there's a community college in the country that could operate without Pell Grants, and that's probably a slight exaggeration, but not that much of one. Second point, to go back directly to your question, is what community colleges do is so diverse, right? Community colleges any one institution doesn't do usually one thing. They do a whole lot of different things. And I think that speaks to the point that anything the federal government's going to do around risk sharing or institutional accountability, it probably makes zero sense, especially for community colleges, to do it at the institution level, because a community college isn't even really a thing, right? It's a conglomeration of units, and it's probably those units that we want to be setting incentives for and holding accountable for student outcomes, and not an entire institution, given that there's surely variation in what happens within institutions.
I know we're all
Go
about
ahead.
time. 2 quick bumper sticker responses too that maybe are alternative or complementary. What if community college students didn't have to borrow in the first place? That would resolve a lot of the problems. And what if states participated with the federal government in using their unemployment insurance data systems more effectively? For example, if there's a way, I don't know, lawyers tell me about this, but if there's a way for states just to flag students who are receiving unemployment insurance, automatically flag them up and have their payments paused. I already see heads shaking, but there's a way states have got to be able to take advantage of their data systems and have them talk to feds.
That was very quick. That was good. I'm going to give you the last word. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And if you have an idea for the next bumper sticker, write it, and we will hopefully bring it to you later this year. Thank you very much.